The Act of Killing. In 2003, American filmmaker Joshua Oppenheimer was working near Medan, Indonesia, when plantation workers told him they were afraid to unionize because their grandparents had been labeled communist sympathizers and killed during the mass killings of the mid-1960s. He decided to make a documentary about that genocide, and what he found changed the nature of the project entirely. The perpetrators were not in hiding, they were not in prison. Many of them were still in positions of local authority, and when Oppenheimer approached them, they were proud. They agreed to reenact their killings on camera, recreating executions, torture, and mutilation with an openness that Oppenheimer described as wandering into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust to find the Nazis still in power. The film was never submitted to Indonesia's Film Censorship Board because doing so would have made every Indonesian who watched it a criminal. It circulated instead through private screenings, DVD copies distributed on request, and eventually a free online release authorized for Indonesian viewers on the anniversary of the genocide in 2013. Many of the Indonesians who worked on the production appear in the credits only as anonymous, unwilling to attach their names to something that could put them at risk. The people responsible for the killings the film documented remained free throughout its production and release. Under the Sun. Russian filmmaker Vitaly Mansky spent 2 years negotiating with North Korea's Ministry of Culture before being granted permission to enter the country and film a documentary portrait of an 8-year-old girl named Jin-mi preparing to join the Korean Children's Union on Kim Jong-il's birthday. The contract he signed gave North Korean authorities complete control over the script, the characters, the camera placements, and which footage would be used. Mansky agreed to those terms and then quietly broke all of them. He brought a Russian translator onto the crew under the cover of being a sound assistant, whose actual job was to listen to what North Korean handlers were saying to each other. He rigged his cameras to record continuously between approved shots, saving footage to 2 memory cards and submitting only one to the authorities for daily review. The hidden footage captured something the approved version never would have. North Korean officials staging every scene, coaching Jin-mi and her family on what to say and how to say it, and constructing the appearance of an ordinary family life from scratch. Mansky smuggled the complete footage out of the country and used it to build a film that was simultaneously the documentary North Korea wanted made and the behind-the-scenes exposure of how it was manufactured. North Korea filed a formal complaint with the Russian Foreign Ministry seeking a banning on all screenings. The complaint failed. The film remains prohibited in North Korea. No Fire Zone. Scottish filmmaker Callum McRae did not shoot a single frame of this documentary himself. The footage he used was recorded by civilians and soldiers on mobile phones and small cameras during the final 138 days of Sri Lanka's civil war in 2009, when the government drove hundreds of thousands of Tamil civilians into designated safe zones and then bombed those zones in order to eliminate the Tamil tigers sheltering among them. The footage McRae assembled showed summary executions, sexual violence, and the deliberate targeting of people who had been told they would be protected. He presented the documentary at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva in 2013, where it was treated as evidence rather than simply as film. Sri Lanka's government called it propaganda. Malaysia banned it outright. India's Film Certification Board refused to approve it for theatrical release. In response, McRae released the film online for free in all 4 countries where it had been blocked, making the act of suppression the mechanism of its distribution. The British Prime Minister at the time said it was one of the most disturbing documentaries he had ever watched. It was nominated for a 2014 International Emmy Award. The events it documented have never resulted in a formal international prosecution. Earthlings. Sean Monson began this project in 1999 after being commissioned to film procedures at animal shelters in Los Angeles. What he witnessed redirected the project entirely. Over the following 6 years, using hidden cameras, he documented conditions inside factory farms, fur farms, slaughterhouses, circuses, and research laboratories across the United States. The footage showed animals confined in spaces too small to turn around in, skinned while being alive, beaten into submission with electric prods, and subjected to cosmetic testing without anesthesia. The industries involved moved to block its release. Major television networks and streaming platforms declined to carry it. Despite that, the film found its audience through independent distribution and online circulation, eventually reaching millions of viewers without any conventional promotional infrastructure. Joaquin Phoenix, who narrated it, said it was the film that generated more conversation than anything else he had ever been involved with. The documentary did not result in significant legislative change in the industries it covered, but it is consistently credited by animal rights activists as one of the most influential pieces of media their movement has ever produced. It remains available online for free. Fahrenheit 9/11. Michael Moore completed this documentary in 2004, and its path to release was complicated before a single audience had seen it. Disney, which owned Miramax, the production company that had funded the film, attempted to block its distribution after learning about its content. The film examined the connections between the Bush administration, the Saudi government, and the bin Laden family, questioned the official account of the 2000 presidential election, and argued that the September 11th attacks had been used to justify a military intervention in Iraq that served interests beyond national security. Moore leaked the dispute to the press. Disney sold the distribution rights for $6 million, and the film went to Cannes, where it won the Palme d'Or. Conservative groups in the United States pressured theater chains not to screen it. The strategy had the opposite effect. On its opening weekend, it became the top-grossing film in the country and went on to become the highest-earning documentary in cinema history at that point. It was screened in Lebanon, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, but banned in Kuwait and heavily restricted in Saudi Arabia. The film's accuracy was disputed at length by journalists and political commentators on both sides of the debate, but the dispute itself became part of the story, extending the documentary's reach well beyond what it would have achieved without the opposition it generated. The Cove. Luis Sehoyos and the former dolphin trainer Rick O'Barry spent years trying to document what was happening in the heavily guarded cove in Taiji, Japan, where local fishermen conducted annual dolphin drives, selling captured animals to marine parks and killing the rest. Japanese authorities refused to grant filming permission. The production team used camouflaged high-definition cameras designed to look like rocks, military-grade thermal imaging, and underwater microphones to capture footage from inside and around the restricted area over multiple nights. What they recorded was the killing of hundreds of dolphins in water that turned red with the volume of blood. The film also presented evidence that dolphin meat being sold in Japanese supermarkets contained mercury levels far above safe limits, and that this fact was being concealed from the Japanese public. The Japanese government described the hunts as a lawful cultural practice and accused the documentary of cultural bias. Screenings in Japan faced threats from nationalist groups and were limited to a handful of venues. The film won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 2010. The dolphin hunts in Taiji have continued every year since its release. Titicut Follies. Frederick Wiseman was a former lawyer who had never made a documentary when he somehow convinced the superintendent of Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Massachusetts to allow him to film inside the facility in 1966. He recorded approximately 80 hours of footage showing patients being strip-searched, force-fed while a guard mocked them, left in cells in conditions that made hygiene impossible, and subjected to the kind of casual dehumanization that comes from an institution that has stopped considering its residents as people. The Massachusetts government moved to suppress the film before it could be publicly screened. A legal battle followed, and in 1968, a court ordered all copies pulled from distribution. It became the first film in American history to be banned for reasons unrelated to national security or obscenity. The official justification was that filming had violated patient privacy and dignity, which was an argument that required ignoring the conditions the patients were being kept in before any camera arrived. Wiseman spent years fighting the ban through the courts. The film was finally permitted limited release in 1991 on the condition that it include a disclaimer stating how much Bridgewater had changed since filming. Whether the disclaimer was accurate was a matter of continued dispute. The War Game. The BBC commissioned Peter Watkins in 1965 to make a documentary exploring what would happen to Britain if a nuclear bomb was dropped on the country. Watkins worked with scientists and civil defense experts, and the result was a meticulously constructed simulation of a Soviet nuclear strike on Kent, England, showing homes reduced to ash, mass burn casualties overwhelming hospitals, food shortages generating civil breakdown, and a government response that was unable to manage the scale of what had occurred. When the film was finished and the BBC screened it for senior executives and government officials, including the Prime Minister, the decision was made not to broadcast it. The stated reason was that the content was too disturbing. The actual reason, as became clearer over time, was that the film demonstrated convincingly that official civil defense planning was inadequate, and that the public trust in the government's ability to manage a nuclear event was not warranted. The BBC suppressed it for 20 years. During that period, it circulated in private screenings, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1967, and became something of an underground legend in Britain, a film whose existence was widely known and whose content almost nobody had seen. It was finally broadcast on British television in July 1985, timed to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. Shoah. Claude Lanzmann spent 11 years making this documentary, which was released in 1985 and runs for over 9 hours. It contains no archival footage of the Holocaust. There are no photographs of camps, no historical film of the war. Instead, Lanzmann filmed lengthy interviews with survivors, witnesses, and in several cases, former perpetrators, some of whom were recorded secretly using hidden cameras. The result is a film that forces the Holocaust to exist entirely in spoken language and present-day landscape, returning with witnesses to the physical locations where mass murder was organized and carried out, and asking them to speak from memory about what they saw and did. Poland banned the film for years. The reason was not the Holocaust itself, but the film's treatment of Polish complicity, which included testimony from Polish villagers who had lived near the camps and described what they had witnessed with a degree of detachment that made uncomfortable viewing for a country that had built a post-war national identity around the ideas of Poles as victims rather than bystanders. The Polish government at the time called it defamatory and inaccurate. The ban itself became a subject of international debate about whether a country could legitimately suppress a historical documentary on the grounds that it reflected poorly on its citizens. The film is now widely considered one of the greatest documentaries ever made. Deliver Us from Evil. Amy Berg released this documentary in 2006, and it follows Oliver O'Grady, a Catholic priest who serially abused children across multiple parishes in California over more than 2 decades, while the church repeatedly moved him rather than reported him to law enforcement. Berg secured an extraordinary level of access for the film, including extended on-camera interviews with O'Grady himself, who by the time of filming had been deported to Ireland after serving a prison sentence. He spoke with a disturbing openness about what he had done, seemingly without full comprehension of the harm he had caused. The film also tracked the church's internal response, using deposition footage and documents to show Cardinal Roger Mahony of Los Angeles acknowledging awareness of the complaints and continuing to transfer O'Grady to new communities where he had access to children. The Catholic Church did not respond to the film publicly in a way that engaged with its specific findings. Several Catholic media organizations discouraged its viewing. It was not banned at a national level in any country, but faced significant institutional pressure that limited its distribution, particularly in regions with strong church influence. It was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. O'Grady was never re-prosecuted. Mahony was not charged with any crime. Bowling for Columbine. Michael Moore released this in 2002, and it used the 1999 Columbine High School shooting as a starting point for broader examination of American gun culture media fear, and the relationship between violence and the availability of firearms. Moore's methods were confrontational and at times theatrically staged. The film's most famous sequence involves him walking into a bank and walking out with a free rifle as part of a promotional offer. He also secured an interview with Charlton Heston, then president of the National Rifle Association, that ended with Heston leaving the room mid-conversation. The film was refused a theatrical release in several American markets where theater owners anticipated organized protests from gun rights groups. Canada screened it widely, but some community groups in rural areas objected to what they described as its misrepresentation of Canadian gun ownership culture. In Australia, some conservative groups called for it to be restricted. The NRA and affiliated organizations mounted a sustained public campaign challenging the film's accuracy and arguing that it was propaganda rather than journalism. Moore acknowledged that some sequences were constructed for effect rather than strict documentary accuracy, which gave critics a legitimate basis for some of their objections. The film won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature and became, at the time, the highest-grossing documentary in American history, a record it held until Fahrenheit 9/11 surpassed it 2 years later. Manufacturing consent. Mark Akbar and Peter Wintenick released this documentary in 1992, based on the work of linguist and political theorist Noam Chomsky, and specifically on the book he co-wrote with Edward Herman, arguing that mainstream media in democratic societies functions as a propaganda system, serving the interests of political and corporate power rather than informing the public in any genuinely independent way. The film uses Chomsky's lectures, interviews, and debates to build a systematic argument about how news is filtered, which stories receive sustained attention and which are ignored, and why the range of opinion permitted in mainstream media is narrower than it appears. It was never banned through any formal legal mechanism, but it was effectively invisible in mainstream broadcast media in the United States and Britain, which was not entirely surprising given that its central argument was that those same media institutions operated as ideological gatekeepers. It circulated through universities, independent cinemas, and activist networks for years before the internet made it more broadly accessible. In several countries with state-controlled or heavily concentrated media ownership, it was simply never distributed. Chomsky himself has noted the irony that the film's marginal distribution in its home country is itself a demonstration of the thesis it was making. It remains one of the most widely viewed political documentaries in history, almost entirely through channels that exist outside the mainstream media infrastructure it was analyzing.